Hey, what's up, mortals? It is I, the Silent Sheepdog, here with a new video for ya. Welcome to part 7 of What If Deku Had the System. I just wanted to greet you guys by saying, just sit back, relax, you are in for a treat. And so, we begin. Time passed rather quickly, and the students spent it as efficiently as they could. In Izuku's case, that meant sending Igris out on his mission, leaving the boy to train on his own mostly. Eventually, the sports festival came around, regardless if the students were prepared or not. The stadium was filled to the brim with both fans and pro-heroes, all in anticipation of what was about to go down. In response to said anticipation were most of the students, feeling rather nervous. Izuku did not belong to this group, for he wasn't nervous. The green-haired boy was just sitting on his lonesome, eyes closed, preparing for what was about to go down. His opponents were all significantly weaker, less experienced in combat, and less cunning than him. With all of these factors considered, he could safely assume that he wouldn't have any issues. Therefore, there was nothing to worry about. Yet, deep down, there was something that bothered him. "Hey, Midoriya," a rather cold voice called out. Izuku didn't open his eyes immediately after hearing this. He first took a deep breath. After that, he looked to see that the person talking to him was Todoroki, looking just as cold as he usually did. Izuku wasn't fazed by this tone, as he remained seated while saying, "Yes, Todoroki?" with a cold voice of his own. Todoroki narrowed his eyes after hearing this, seemingly annoyed by Izuku's response, as he slowly approached him while saying, "I don't know what to make of you. When I first saw you, I didn't think much of you. To me, you just looked like an above-average student with an interesting quirk. But things started to change after the battle simulation, and I doubt that I'm the only one who believes that." With the same cold voice. Izuku got a little curious upon hearing this, but when he took a glance around the room, it almost surprised him. Judging by everyone's expressions, he could tell that they agreed with Todoroki, and it concerned him a little. First you were unfazed by a devastating explosion. That alone was a red flag. Then the incident at the USJ happened, and we all know what came out of that, the bi-colored teen then said. Izuku grew a little impatient upon hearing this, as he said, "Can you get to the point? You're making me sleepy, and it's not acting," with an unamused tone. Todoroki seemed to get even more annoyed now, before continuing by saying, "I'll admit that you're strong, but that doesn't matter. I'm going to defeat you and that shadow army of yours," with a voice that sounded far more intimidating. The students were all shocked by this, for to them it sounded like Todoroki had just declared war. Izuku still wasn't impressed. He just looked at Todoroki in silence, until he sighed and stood up. This snapped everyone's attention, for to them it looked like Izuku was ready to answer Todoroki's declaration. They would all be shocked, however, when Izuku finally spoke up. "I can't accept your challenge, Todoroki, because doing so would imply that you're my equal. I won't be using shadow soldiers today. But even so, you cannot hope to match me, especially in your current state," he said, using a cold voice of his own. Todoroki tried to remain stoic, but not even he could prevent himself from being visibly irritated now. The others didn't expect this. They thought that Izuku would have accepted Todoroki's challenge to a certain degree, but instead, he boldly claimed that the latter had been too weak for that to happen. If he had planned to use his shadows, they might have understood Izuku, but that wasn't the case. Now, because of the Greenette's previous claim, they thought that Todoroki's reaction had been somewhat justified. The room fell silent once again, with the two teens staring each other down. One was visibly irritated, while the other couldn't care less. This silence was quickly broken, however, when a loud voice suddenly shouted, "Hey nerd! Icy hot! Don't you dare leave me out of this! I'll beat you both!" Quite aggressively. Everyone turned to see that it was Bakugo, showing off his explosive nature. Izuku remained unamused, looking coldly at the blonde, as he responded by saying, "Bakugo, the obvious gap between us has been made clear since day one. I suggest that you give up on this while you still have some dignity left," with a tone that sounded a little more annoyed than before. Bakugo just got infuriated upon hearing this, as he walked up and grabbed the green-haired boy by the collar before shouting, "Who the hell died and made you King, Deku?" more aggressively than before. The class jumped a little upon hearing this, but they had also expected this kind of response. Izuku, however, seemed to be in shock. He was silent, eyes wide open, and they didn't know why. They didn't know what he was feeling or what he was thinking, but in a weird way, it looked like something within him had snapped. This claim was reinforced further when Izuku swiped Bakugo's hand away while angrily shouting, "Get your hands off me, you bastard!" Everyone stood frozen with shock now, even Bakugo to some extent. They have seen Izuku get angry before, multiple times actually, but this was different. In those other instances, he had remained in control and maintained his cold aura, but that was gone now. This was a hot, an uncontrollable hatred escaping through his voice, and no one understood where it had come from. Did Bakugo's words trigger something within Izuku? Was there something else bothering him? Or was it both? Now the room fell into a much deeper silence, so heavy that it created tension. No one said anything. No one dared to say anything. They just stared at Izuku, who was breathing heavily while aiming a hateful glare at Bakugo. The blonde didn't say anything. He just looked surprised to see Izuku so angry. Todoroki also had his gaze locked onto Izuku. The way he had reacted stood out to him, as if he recognized it in some way. Then, as he thought about it more, he started to realize why that was, but he almost didn't want to believe it. The tension finally disappeared, as the silence was broken when Present Mic announced their entry. It had made some of the students jump, but most were just happy that the whole ordeal had blown over. Present Mic's voice served as an anchor for Izuku, dragging him back to his senses. He then took a deep breath and exhaled, before walking towards the locker room exit. I've given my answer. I don't accept your challenges, but I also won't hesitate to defend myself and my values. And when I do, not a single shadow will rise in my name, he then said, before leaving through the doors. After the class made their entrance, they were introduced by Present Mic. The opening speech was held by Bakugo, who did nothing but claim that he was going to win. This officially made everyone target Class 1A over everyone else, and they themselves cursed Bakugo for it. After that, the first round was announced to be an obstacle race, which was exactly what it sounded like. In its simplest form, it was an obstacle course where the participants had to race to the end. The students all readied themselves after hearing this, all determined to win. Izuku readied himself in his own way, carefully observing his surroundings. This wasn't anything new for the green-haired boy, but now he had to put a little more effort into it. Usually, he would have had Igris's help with this, but since the Shadow Knight wasn't present, he needed to do this on his own. This analysis lasted only for a few seconds, but it was enough. Now Izuku was prepared for the race. "Start!" Present Mic then shouted, announcing the beginning of the race. The students wasted no time after hearing this as they rushed forward at full speed. It didn't take long before they realized the error in their ways. The first obstacle was to pass through a corridor, which was impossible with the amount of students trying to cram their way through it all at the same time. The only one who didn't fall for the trap was Izuku, because he had already noticed it before. The green-haired boy had stood still after hearing the starting shot and waited for this to happen. Now he just needed to bypass the students. Then he would have a clear path in front of him. Todoroki was trapped in the middle of the swarm, unable to move in any way. He was going to try to slip through the crowd somehow until he saw something above him. He looked to see that it was Izuku, dashing between the walls over the ocean of students. Shortly after that, the green-haired boy landed on the other end of the corridor, as he took off without resistance. This sight infuriated Todoroki to no end. He had just declared war on the very Greenette, yet he himself was unable to make any form of progress. Anger built up within the boy until he had enough. In an instant, he used his ice, freezing the entirety of the hallway in the process. This gave Todoroki what he needed as he broke loose. The ice user chased after his green-haired adversary, not minding the other students that had either avoided or broken free from the ice. They all ran at full speed, either trying to overtake each other or the one that had gotten a head start. Todoroki kept advancing without regard for his surroundings until the next obstacle arrived. Towering above them, all were a bunch of gigantic robots, all looking ready to crush whoever came in their way. The majority of the students recognized these machines as the Zero Pointers from the entrance exam, but Todoroki didn't care about that. His eyes were focused on Izuku, who easily dashed past all the robots. The ice user needed to catch up, so he did the only thing he could think of. Once again, using his ice, he froze the Zero Pointers in place. The other students were stunned by this display of power as they watched the man responsible run past this obstacle. They immediately tried to follow him until something stopped them. The towering robots were still frozen in place, but one of them wasn't balanced. It didn't take long before the machine toppled over, falling towards the multiple students below. Everyone panicked and tried to run out of harm's way, but they weren't fast enough. The robot was falling towards them at a rapid speed, and there wasn't enough time to dodge. The panicked students braced themselves, waiting for impact, which never came. Everyone looked up to see that the robot had stopped. It was suspended in the air. No one understood what was happening, for the machine was suddenly defying the laws of gravity, until they looked to the other side of the field. There they could see a familiar Greenette, holding his arms out in an odd pose. It was Izuku, using his telekinesis on the Zero Pointer. The students didn't know what to think of this, especially those from Class 1A. They weren't just stunned by his power. The implications of his actions affected them the most. Izuku had actively taken the time to save them all, knowing that Todoroki would overtake him if he did. The green-haired boy kept his metaphysical grasp over the robot, not allowing it to move. He clenched his teeth down hard as he slowly began to move the machine. The longer he did this, the more frustrated he got. Then it all peaked when he suddenly thought about Todoroki. The mere idea of how the ice user had left these students to die filled him with nothing but burning hot rage. Izuku clenched his teeth even harder until blood gushed out of his mouth as he threw all the robots with a furious bellow. The machine crashed into the earth with a fiery explosion, and any observer's jaws seemed to drop with them. The green-haired boy coughed and panted heavily, but no one could tell if it was from exhaustion or rage. Izuku then turned back to the path, looking onwards. Farther ahead he could see the split hair of Todoroki, and the mere sight of him made him angry. "You bastard!" The green-haired boy growled before taking off at full speed. The next obstacle was not difficult for Izuku. He jumped between the platforms in the canyon, crossing it much faster than the others. Then he continued running for the next obstacle, which happened to be a minefield. Normally, Izuku would have taken his time crossing the field, but there wasn't enough time to do that. Todoroki was still in front of him, and he was already in the middle of the minefield, doing exactly what Izuku would have done. The green-haired boy didn't hate Todoroki, but right now he was very upset with him. Therefore, he dashed across the minefield, outrunning the explosions that were being triggered. Todoroki could hear the explosions behind him, and he turned around to see that Izuku was approaching. The ice user panicked, deciding to lay a path of ice so that he could run instead. But the second that he picked up speed, Izuku was already beside him. The bicolored teen couldn't believe his eyes, for it shouldn't have been possible. Izuku wasn't that close less than a moment ago, yet he had already caught up to him. Just how fast was he? He didn't get to answer this question, as Izuku took a rather odd step. The green-haired boy had maintained a certain pattern when running, but now he had broken it for some reason. It wasn't until Todoroki was hit by an explosion that he had realized what happened. Izuku had intentionally stepped onto a mine that was right next to Todoroki, making it so that he would have been hit by the explosion. The green-haired boy had gone out of his way to sabotage his bicolored classmate, even though he could have proceeded without doing so. The explosion sent Todoroki off balance, forcing him to stop as a result. He did manage to regain himself without falling over, but by that point, it was too late. Izuku had already made it past him, and now he had no hope of catching up. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Staying safe online is an ever-growing difficulty, and hackers could exploit you. NordVPN allows you to change your IP address, making you harder to track, securing your privacy. In addition to providing you with safe passage through the web, you can also expand the reach of your favorite streaming services. Are you tired of going through 2, 3, or even 4 streaming services to watch your favorite anime? Well, with NordVPN, You can change your country and be able to binge shows like My Hero Academia, Naruto, and many others on your favorite streaming services with just the press of a button. Check out the link in the description to get 72% off when buying for 2 years, $3.29 a month. This deal is for a limited time. And thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Izuku had gotten first place shortly after, being greeted by an arena full of cheers. Todoroki had been far more compromised than anticipated. Therefore, Bakugo managed to pass him and take second place. This left the ice user in third place, and very unsatisfied as a result. Meanwhile, Izuku was surrounded by many of his classmates. They all praised him for his performance, all showing just how awestruck they had been by him. They soon noticed that he wasn't paying them any attention, and that his gaze was off somewhere else. When they turned to see what he was looking at, they noticed that it was Todoroki. Uraraka was one of the classmates that had surrounded the green-haired boy, and just like the others, she wondered what was going on.
Is everything all right, Deku?
The brown-haired girl asked, sounding very confused as she did. Izuku didn't respond to this. He probably didn't even hear her. He just continued to stare at his ice-using classmate. That is, until he started to move. Uraraka was surprised by this, but she didn't say anything. She just watched as Izuku walked towards Todoroki at a steady pace, while calling out, "Hey! Todoroki!" Quite angrily. Todoroki jumped upon hearing his name, especially with that tone. He looked at Izuku and asked, "What is it, Midori?" But was immediately cut off when the green-haired boy had made it up to him. Now everyone had been stunned into silence. Even the audience. They couldn't have seen this coming. They couldn't have known that Izuku was going to punch Todoroki in the face like that. The bi-colored teen was pushed back, falling to the ground with a bruised cheek before looking up at Izuku. "What the hell was that out there?" The green-haired boy shouted, sounding angrier than before. The observers were still in shock and didn't understand what Izuku was talking about. All while Todoroki frowned before standing back up. "What are you talking about?" he then asked, also sounding a little angry. Izuku got only more irritated as he responded by shouting, "You know exactly what I'm talking about! You're not dumb! And I'm not blind! That robot was intentionally set to crush those students!" Now everyone fell silent once again. Only it was in disbelief this time. Both the audience and the students remembered what he was talking about, and they realized that he was right. Someone could have gotten hurt. Or worse, had Izuku not been there. Todoroki also began to stagger upon hearing this, thinking back on his actions, as he looked at Izuku and said, I was absorbed into the competition. I didn't realize what I was doing," with a voice that seemed to be weighed down by guilt and regret. This didn't calm Izuku down at all. He only got angrier. "I don't believe that for a second! Even if it was true, doesn't change the fact that you could have killed someone!" The green-haired boy said venomously. He then slowly stepped closer towards Todoroki, looking ready to attack him, until Kirishima got between them. "Knock it off, you two! There's no point in fighting like this!" the redhead then said, trying to talk some sense into them both. Izuku wasn't budging, however, as he looked at Kirishima before saying, "Why are you talking, Kirishima? You were almost made a victim of his incompetence," with a calmer, yet still irritated voice. Kirishima couldn't find any words for a response, because Izuku was right. He was one of the students that would have been crushed, and there was no telling that he would have made it out. Still, even after acknowledging this, the redhead remained between his two classmates without saying a word. Everyone was now silent once again, not knowing what to say or do. The audience began talking amongst themselves, and one could imagine that it wasn't good. "Midoriya, I understand your frustration, but we need to continue," Midnight then said, deciding to finally put an end to this little incident. Izuku didn't respond to this. He just stared at Todoroki with his menacing eyes. Then he used his hand to clean the blood from his mouth and chin, before wiping it onto Todoroki's face. The ice user shivered at this, as the right side of his face was now covered in Izuku's blood. "There. Now your face is symmetrical," he then said, before walking off with Kirishima in tow. Todoroki didn't know how to react to this. for it was a mixture of different emotions. On one end, he wanted to get angry with what Izuku had done to him, but on the other, he couldn't. Somehow he felt that this was symbolic, and that this was Izuku's way of expressing what he wanted to say, whatever that may be. The students then gathered themselves as they turned their attention towards midnight. The R-rated hero then proceeded to explain the next round, which was going to be a cavalry battle. The students would make up teams of a maximum of 4 members. Each team would be given a headband that represented their points, and their point value was determined by each member's placement in the obstacle race. The goal was to steal as many headbands as possible, and the team with the most points in the end would be crowned the winners. Midnight then went through everyone's point value, until she said something that would prove to be an issue. The one who had gotten first place, Izuku, was worth 10 million points, which made him a target right off the bat. Izuku immediately realized this fact, and he could already see it being a problem. Sure, with these points he had guaranteed victory if he could keep them, but that is exactly why he would be everyone's #1 target. This also meant that building a team would prove difficult, because who in their right mind would want to make themselves everyone's target before the battle had even started?
Hey Deku, let's team up!
A cheerful and feminine voice then said. Izuku was immediately knocked out of his thoughts, realizing that they were given time to build their teams. He then turned to see who had spoken, and he was shocked. Uraraka? The green-haired boy had asked, sounding very surprised. It wasn't just Uraraka. Lined up next to her were Tokoyami and Kirishima, both looking eager to join Izuku's team. Izuku was both shocked and surprised, as he looked at all 3 of them and said, "Okay, I'm not saying that you're crazy, but you're crazy. You do realize that joining my team comes with more problems than advantages, right?" With a voice that clearly showed his shock, the trio looked at each other, all showing a confused expression, until they spoke up. "That's not how I see it. You've shown that you're far more competent than anyone else, and your strategic mindset can really shine in this type of challenge," Tokoyami said, sounding just as serious as usual.
I agree, and since we all know each other, we'll be able to cooperate,
Uraraka then said, sounding as cheerful as always. "Yeah, and you also have all the strength and manliness to back it up," Kirishima then added, his voice being just as fired up as it usually was. Izuku was still shocked, as Tokoyami then added the finishing thought. "The way we see it, joining you has nothing but benefits." Now Izuku didn't know what to say. He just chuckled, confusing everyone in the process. He did notice this confusion, so he cleared it up by saying, It's nothing. I just thought that everyone would avoid me like the plague," with a more cheerful tone. The trio smiled upon hearing this, happy to hear that they were now a team. "So, what's the plan, boss?" Kirishima then asked with the same voice as usual. Izuku scratched his chin for a while, thinking about what to do. Then he was reminded of a certain skill he had obtained just recently, one that was directly connected to the powers of the Shadow Monarch. Normally it would have been useless in this situation, since he wasn't using his shadow soldiers, but his teammates changed that. One of them specifically could be very much compatible with this new skill. "Tokoyami, does Dark Shadow grow stronger while in darkness?" the green-haired boy then asked, while still scratching his chin. Tokoyami was confused by this question as he simply answered, Yes. Why are you asking?" while showing just how confused he was. Izuku only grinned upon hearing this, and his teammates still didn't know what was going on. But there was one thing they could tell for certain, and that was that their captain did have something planned. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would like to just let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you need is right here in the description below, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects that our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I would like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye, and have a divine day.